Hola, pod peeps across the digital domain. It's the Deacons Pod, where spirituality and justice meet real American life in the 21st century. I'm Deacon Dennis. Say hello to my co-conspirators, Paulist affiliate deacons, Deacon Tom and Deacon Drew.
It is good to be with you guys again. I missed you, since we only speak every 3 or 4 days. But so what's happened lately? Tom, I understand there may be something new going on in your ministry. What's going on?
This is true. I just transferred from one parish down here to another, about 7 miles away, and it was a great experience. But I did have rather an interesting entry here, as I was scheduled to preach for the 11 o'clock mass, and it happened to coincide here. It was the first Sunday of Lent. Coincided with our parish mission, which had brought in some musicians to do the music for mass. So our regular organist was not there. So Father said, "Hey, Deke, can you do the announcements?" I said, "Oh, sure, Father." So he gives me the announcements before mass, and I take them and I put them up on the ambo. I come back, and it's a busy place. People are coming in, and I'm a new face, so everybody's coming up to me and welcoming me and doing, that nice gesture as the new deacon. And all of a sudden, I hear in the background, hey, who's doing the announcements? And I said, "Oh, gosh, well, that would be me." And I go up there because it's already 11 o'clock now, since I was asleep saying hello to people. And I turn around. I had placed the announcements up there, but I get up there, and all of a sudden I can't find them. So I just speak to the congregation. I said, "Well, just like being at home, I misplaced something." So I go back to the sacristy and I look, and they're not there. So I make the return trip to the ambo, which time I have to confess, I said, "Well, I've completely lost the announcements, so I'm going to have to do it from memory." Which is a bad thing at even at 11 o'clock in the morning. So I spiel off what I remembered, and then I asked for congregation participation. Like, is there anybody out there who's doing something that I have not mentioned? I get a couple things, like CCW is doing something for trafficked women and children. That's great. And there's the Knights of Columbus are doing the fish fries. Okay, that's good.
So you're doing a call and response. You're saying,
yeah.
You, what have you got? Oh, I'm in this group, and they're yelling it out for the congregation before mass.
Correct. I thought it was in very.
It was probably a lot more effective than the normal reading of the announcements.
Well, this is true.
Everybody else is ready to go home.
Way to make a first impression, Tom.
Well, that's what I'm thinking
Good
here.
man.
I've given up all my pride at this point.
That's right. You got nothing.
Well, I'm interested in the dead air that must have occurred when you left the ambo to go back to the sacristy. Did the priest walk off the altar as well?
Oh, he wasn't even there yet. This is before mass. So, but no, there was no dead air. You can hear the little murmuring going on in the
murmuring like, wherever he goes. That's kind of Casey's trademark here,
we got the idiot. We drew the short straw, right?
Well, this is a real lesson for anyone basically who might be listening, who may be thinking that they want to be a deacon in our church. Because I remember when I was in formation, the one thing they kept telling us every other week was, you need to be flexible when you're up on that altar. Anything can happen.
And
well, this was self-inflicted, as I'm very capable of doing.
Are you sure it's self-inflicted, or are you just assuming that? I mean, did someone move it, or did you?
Well, no. So there's finally at the end, as I'm getting ready now, the musicians it was a family group, and they're only about 3 feet over from the altar, and one of the young ladies reaches over and lifts up the prayers of the faithful that had been put on top of the announcements. After it was all done, I just looked over and said, "Well, thank you very much. Now I will read the announcements." So, and but what was interesting? So I went back to the sacristy. We picked up the book of the Gospels, and then proceeded to begin mass in a serious tone. And but after mass, I was amazed. More than a few people came up to me, and they just shook my hand, introduced themselves. One man said, that was the best stand-up comedy routine I've seen in church in my entire life. And I said, well, thank you. It's not planned, for one. And but
They haven't
other
seen
people
anything yet. I can tell them that right now. Maybe I should stop over there at Joan of Arc and say, hey, oh, you like that? Wait, give it a while.
Wait, there's more. So, but other people come up and they talked about not being pretentious and not being imperfect and just being, making that personal connection with me about welcome to the real world. You know what it's like. You're not faking this. And one person even said it's nice to have some genuine people around here. Not that the others are not. One of the reasons I embrace this parish is because it's about a third of the size of my former parish. And it's a lot more genuine in the way people respond to the liturgies, the pastor, the other deacons. And I felt very much at home, which is why when I started this buffoon act, I didn't choke up like I would
So you
if
just
that
went
happened
with it.
anywhere else.
You didn't make a big deal. You just kind of flowed with the situation, and people appreciated that you were not an empty suit and flustered and,
Correct.
in your humility, of course. I can see it shining across from me as it is. And knowing you for too many years to mention, I know that you have a lot to be humble about. So that's a good thing.
Well, I'd say humility is the hallmark of being a deacon. I'm actually very proud of my own humility.
There you go.
Well, you should be, yeah.
Today we are going to speak with Paulist Father, Stuart Wilson Smith. I first met Father Stu a few years ago at St. Paul the Apostle, the mother church in New York City. He's been a priest for a few years. I saw him again the following year as he gave the homily for an ordination mass for one of his colleagues. We have joked together, prayed together, commiserated together through the pandemic, and I have watched him sing and play with the Paulists and on his own and in his own recordings. He's a dynamic priest, and he's a great all-around guy.
Welcome, Father Stu. It's nice to talk to you. Nice to meet you, digitally at least.
Great to be
Yeah.
here.
My first question that comes to mind is, how did a nice Canadian boy get hooked up with an American group like the Paulist Fathers?
Sure, no, it's a fair enough question. I think especially this day and age, when we don't presently have a Paulist foundation in Canada, we did once upon a time. And so that's really where I got linked up, was in Toronto. But even before that, I had heard about the Paulists in a couple of places. One, I was in spiritual direction for a while and was thinking about whether I wanted to be a priest in a diocesan setting, like in this case, the Archdiocese of Toronto, or a religious order. And I'd had one priest who was familiar with the Paulists, who worked at St. Peter's in Toronto, as well as the Catholic Information Center, and who appreciated their style and their charisms and the things they were about. And I think eventually I just started to make these connections, and I was looking for religious communities online, and I found the Paulists again, and I was like, this really does look like a fit. Makes a lot of sense. And so I reached out to the Paulist vocation director at the time, a guy who can kind of help you figure out if this is a good fit or not.
What about the Paulist was a good fit for you?
Yeah, so for me, there was a lot of things. There's the sort of higher level stuff that we call the charism. So those are the things that we believe the Holy Spirit has gifted the Paulists with, that is a particular, a gift in turn to the church and to the world. Evangelization, reconciliation, ecumenism, and interfaith relation. And for me, the ecumenism was appealing because I come from a background already where my mother, God rest her, my mom was Catholic and my father is Anglican. And I kind of grew up with an exposure to both traditions, and I felt very comfortable in the Anglican Church, and I felt very interested in trying to see how these things could be united together, and why must there be a kind of a difference or an issue in keeping them apart.
Father Stu, I'm interested that you were at the Newman Center there at Ohio State University. And, part of our reason for doing this is trying to reach young people. You have a lot of students looking who are who are trying to figure out life at that age?
Oh, certainly. I mean, there's always seekers just about everywhere that you go. I think I was maybe more surprised that there were so many who were already very, very, very committed and were, if anything, looking to go deeper into their faith. But the thing is, like, as a Paulist, and this is part of what attracted me to the community, our eyes are always sort of beyond the pews, if you will. You know, I like Catholics, obviously, you know, it's part of my job, but, you know, my heart is for people who aren't around and trying to see if there's ways that I could introduce them to our faith, and most especially our Lord, and experience the sense of joy and fulfillment that comes with that. I just think it was sort of a situation where I had to look for people who weren't fitting into those groups, and, you know, that met regularly or aren't in the Bible study, and the fact is, I found there were a lot of them. You know, I mean, in some ways, that might be even a large part of the people who came to Mass regularly or semi-regularly at the Newman Center, just kind of come and go and live their lives, and God bless them. I love them.
Yeah.
You know,
Pick up what they need on the way, get that nourishment. Yeah, that's part of our deacon charism too, is like, who's not at the table? Who's not there? Who's not being served or overlooked? And that seems to be a bigger and bigger group of people today.
You're now in a parish ministry, correct?
Yeah, so I've been at Old St. Mary's Church here in Chicago. I'm just almost at 3 years here. I've really loved it. I'm on a temporary hiatus right now because, as we've noted, not that this is a fault of mine, but I am Canadian, and I've been in this country 10 years, but every time I have to keep renewing a temporary, you know, status. So right now I'm in process for a permanent resident status, green card. And we're just waiting for that to come through.
Did you find a big difference between campus ministry and parish ministry, or not?
Yeah, there can be. I'd say at the Newman Center was quite extraordinary because it felt like a parish home, and it had, and I'd say was enriched significantly by the presence of what we called our resident community, who are people like faculty, staff, and alumni of the Ohio State University. As well as those who were just attracted to the Paulist charism, who came to join us for Mass on the weekends and who were very active in our justice ministries. But parish ministry has been different insofar as there's just a lot more ministering from across the full spectrum of people's lives. You know, I was in campus ministry. I was, of course, mostly dealing and working alongside like 18 to 22, 23-year-olds. And I did find that some of the questions and concerns could be very different from what I'm up to here, which is everything from the kids in our school, which is pre-K through 8th grade. And one of my favorite ministries at Old St. Mary's really is just having the chance to visit with people. I think especially visiting the elderly and the sick and people who aren't able to leave their homes for one reason or another. Having the chance to do that in a parish, that's like one thing I just love about a parish, is the feeling of being close to and alongside such a wide spectrum of people.
Well,
So tell us about the book. That sounds interesting.
really.
that's
Yeah.
what I was going to piqued our interest now.
Sure, yeah. I'm hoping to write from perspective as both a sufferer of mental illness, but also someone who I find I'm like a solace and a comfort in my faith that I hope I can try to communicate in some way that is not just, again, not to denigrate Catholicism, because that's obviously contra the point, but that's not just piety. You know, that's not just saying, if you feel depressed, have you thought about 5 Hail Marys? Because I think sometimes we approach mental illness like sin. I'm much more interested in trying to give people a message of solidarity, of how Christ and the church are with you, no matter where you are, whether you're quote unquote like in a kind of recovery phase where you're getting help, or you're still really lost and unsure of what to do. And also a message of that I think is kind of countercultural, that also if you're not able to function and if you can't produce what you feel like, because comparison's a big problem with people that I encounter and, you know, with this kind of issue. It's like, why can't I work like this person? Why can't I get up in the morning and get out of bed and do these things? And just to try to convey a message that Christ too is with you too, and that your dignity is forever and is not affected by by how well you produce and you function. You're always good. You're always beloved.
I think that's a very exciting thing. I'm not really an expert on this, but I guess the church came a little bit after other people in terms of alcoholism and embracing alcoholics rather than stigmatizing them. And do you think maybe we're on the verge of doing that now with mental illness?
I hope so. And I think if we are, it's really on account of just regular everyday Catholics who have tried to share their own story to break the stigma a bit. I know that's what's empowered me and given me confidence, or is other Catholics that I've encountered along the way, whether ministerially or otherwise, who said, you know what, I am going to be a little more open about this, precisely because there do seem to still be Catholics who are afraid to say that I'm mentally ill and that and above and beyond that, like I even require medication for that. And the stigma that I think you can still encounter in some place, because something I'd really like to understand, that whether you're sick or well, that God's love is steady, and so is your dignity and goodness. And so I think there's more work to be done there, but I think you're right. I think we're starting to catch up a little bit and understand that these things like don't have to be so separated. We're spiritual beings and we're physical beings, and there's an intimate connection between the two, and God is interested and loves both.
And you see a society turning away from, the next generation, turning away from anything spiritual. And you wonder, are they not going to fall into that rat race of that whole false image concept, all chasing because they think they can do it all? They're young, they're invincible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of those things where more of us who struggle need to be a little more open about it, so that it almost kind of helps people feel the permission to be that way. Because I think otherwise it's just hard to break out of the culture or out of your group that is all thinking this way about grind culture, about succeeding, about, as they used to say, let's get that bread. That's a former expression of let's get that money, let's chase it. It's hard to be the one, if that's your friend group, it's hard to be the one that's trying to pursue something else. I think that's hard. So it kind of takes one person at a time to sort of bravely step forward.
I think once you put that part of your persona out there, that vulnerability, you will, because you're right. There's not a lot of that deep communication, that intimate communication coming on. We hide behind the words. We hide behind the scriptural passage. And I know from my own experiences, when you do expose a vulnerability, people see it as real.
Yeah, absolutely. When I started doing hospital ministry, especially when I was in clinical pastoral education and a couple other programs like that, I realized there was kind of two choices here. I could kind of go down the road of putting up like a pastoral facade, you might call it, where you walk into the room and it's like, I'm the holy man, and I'm here to impart my gifts of wisdom and understanding unto you, and to give you these gifts of whatever. And so I could kind of go that route. And in a sense, it is easier because you can separate all the messiness that is yourself, that is your own pain and darkness and sin and struggle and all that stuff. But I know for me, being on the other end of that kind of ministry, like that's never served me well. I've never been loved well by it, and I've never met Christ through it in the way that I have through ministers that have been honest and authentic and vulnerable with me.
Do you have a way of approaching people who want to get out of the church, who for whatever reasons they have, tell you they're about to leave? Or the same is true, I don't know if it's the same pitch that you might have, and pitch really cheapens the whole thing, to people who might be seeking to come into the church. In other words, how do we bring them in and how do we keep them from leaving? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I will say it does seem like Paulists maybe encounter a larger percentage of those folks than maybe other groups for whatever reason. Other people trust us or understand that.
I think it's approachability, but anyway.
Maybe, yeah. I don't know that I've found like the right things to say necessarily. I've more so found what I don't want to say or do. Maybe part of that is listening to them and what they've heard from people that kind of really doesn't work and may even be insulting. I think, because a go-to that you'll see on social media, if somebody on Twitter like posts, I think I've had it with the church, this is the last scandal that I can handle. And then somebody inevitably will reply, to whom else shall we go? They'll reply from Peter there, Lord, to whom else shall we go? Very nice sentiment. Very nice sentiment, as in there's nowhere else to go but the Catholic Church. But it's like you're saying that to someone who has been actively hurt and alienated and disenfranchised, and you think that's going to work. And I just don't think that really ministers to them in that moment. And so if anything, I think what I've just tried to do is maintain relationship as much as is possible. I tend to think that that's also the key for the other question of people who are coming in. You really have to kind of throw yourself on the trust of the Holy Spirit and this was big for our founder of the Paulist Fathers, Father Isaac Hecker, the same Spirit that dwells in the church dwells in each and every person. Well, you have to have an awareness that it's not all on my shoulders. The Holy Spirit is going to stay with that person. We just trust that the Lord will continue to work in their life.
It seems to me sometimes also it's effective. I've learned when people come to me and they tell me all the things that are wrong with the church, and then I agree with them.
Yeah.
And they're taken aback.
Rather shocking. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's that relationship. You mentioned relationship, developing it, maintaining it, keeping it, and not cutting it off. I think that's so important.
Yeah, I think that's a big deal. And likewise, I think for people who are coming into the church or exploring or who are curious, I try to be as much of a friend as possible, a friend in the Lord, to sort of walk with them and explore the beauties and richness of our faith. You just have to have an encounter with people who are suffering and in need to really, as if you will, get your faith going, because that's where Christ is, And so I was really grateful that even in the Paulists, where my perception was, okay, this is a group that does like evangelization programs, and they seem kind of neat and flashy. They got the guy, Father Dave Dwyer, he's got a radio show, and that's really cool. And there's all these elements that people think of when they think evangelization. And yet when I joined the novitiate, the first thing Father Rich Colgan, who became my novice director, the first thing he asked us to do was to go serve at a home that was for lower income seniors, like people that may otherwise not be able to afford to be, in a home and care for them. And we went over and we would visit, with them and try to understand their lives. And at first you might be confused, you're thinking like, well, I joined this for evangelization, but the truth is you're not going to get it. You're not going to understand what Christ is about or what it is that you're trying to share without meeting Christ and the poor and the sick and in those most in need.
Well, that one of the things they say about Catholic social teaching is that it's the biggest secret that we have, and so much confusion, and it's pretty much laid dormant for so long. But that teaching has fallen victim to a lot of just the higher intellectual theology that comes out of our pulpits a lot of times.
You're right. And it's beautiful stuff. It's just, you're right. How do we teach it and share it and appropriate it? And I think in communities, it can involve a sort of cultural shift about how we think. And you have to maybe be willing to be vulnerable enough to be willing to change the way things have always been, because that's often the reason communities don't change, and any organization, is this is the way that we've done it. And there doesn't seem to be a problem. But it's like, you maybe aren't hearing the problem because the people who aren't there aren't there to speak, and I think that's true for a lot of folks in a lot of communities. I know if you were a young LGBTQ Catholic and you knew that there was no precedent of LGBTQ cantor or lector or someone in observable ministry, if you knew there'd never been a homily preached that affirmed and loved you, if there was no semblance of any of that, then you don't have the safety to enter into that community and feel like you're going to be held and cared for. And then on the contrary, if you do think to do those things, then the chances are better of entering into that community and finding people who can be in solidarity with you. So it takes like some thought to think about, what does our parish look like? What do people see when they come into our community? What's their impression when they open up the bulletin and they see what organizations are there? Because I think those smaller things matter, and they point to what the community cares about and whether we are or are not picking up our Lord's mission to be in solidarity with each other, to care for each other, and serve each other.
You see, my question was precisely to that point. It seems to me the problem is one of commitment and long term. It's whatever the institutional problems might be. Or the other thing is that I keep running into is the sense of perfectionism, which I taught high school for many years, so I understand if they're high school kids, you fall into that, just finding out everything's not perfect, and it's a scandal for all of us. I understand that, but you get into 45-year-old people when you're talking to them, and it's like, what do you got that's perfect? I mean, you haven't. There's nothing perfect on this planet. It doesn't matter where you go, what you do, but there's an insistence on if it's not perfect, it doesn't get my commitment. And so therefore there is no buy-in on a long term. There is a one-off, I'll show up, but there seems to be, and again, across the board, just a lack of, of buy-in to commit to any cause, anything over a long term. And I don't know what we can do about it. I mean, we suffer from it too, as a church, but it's marriage. It's why get married? Why, it's like any commitment.
No, sure. And I think there's probably a degree to which some of these problems are distinctly Western by virtue, or quote unquote first world problems, in as much as we may have a lot more options, and the proliferation of options sometimes makes it harder to commit to these things. But I do find that with anybody, I think anybody who's worked in vocations work would say the same thing. It's hard to find someone willing to necessarily jump into that with only a minimal amount of data, even though that's what people used to do. And no, I don't know beyond that, other than being accustomed to having options open in a way that may be relatively unprecedented. I don't know that. I don't have the answer. Yeah.
Well, Father Stu, what would you like to talk about to wrap us up, take us home?
Well, I would talk maybe just for a second. I guess I don't know that. I wish the Paulist Fathers were better known. I don't. We're not up to the tier of your Jesuits and your Franciscans or whatnot. And on one level, I'm cool with that, because I like that we're a small and specialized group, and always have been. But I sometimes think, and this is something I think appropriate among us who are, obviously interested in the Paulist charism. I would just say, sometimes people are suspicious of what they perceive. Like, if you just review the stuff I've talked about, right, in this conversation, in this podcast, someone could listen to this and say, okay, I get it. Those Paulists are liberal. And whether that gets you on board or written off, or you write us up, it's like, sometimes I feel like that happens. And I think what I'm interested in as I continue to live into my Paulist vocation is to understand that our concerns and the things that my heart is really with and for comes from the center of the church. When I talk about God's love for gay people, for trans people, when I talk about God's love for people who are mentally ill, who are depressed, who are anxious, who don't feel like they're as good as other people, I don't want to be seen as like some kind of rebel, if that makes sense, because I'm not. And that shouldn't be the position. And I don't want it to be seen as liberal. I want it to be understood that those things are this service that the Paulists are trying to offer the church. And it comes from the center and the heart of Christ. And I think the better we can understand it that way, hopefully the less resistance we can have among people who just kind of write us off and say, that's the liberal group, whatever. Like for myself, I like good liturgy. It doesn't mean I want to suddenly, start changing everything about that. Like I'm in this because I love the faith. I just think that these emphases and the call to serve the marginalized and those most peripheral is coming from the heart of the church and not some rebel stance. So anyway, I just mentioned that because it's a constant thought in my head and something I'm aware of.
Well, you're a musician.
Me.
We should just at least talk a little bit about that. Now, you have recorded 2 or 3 albums.
So I have 2. One that's under my own name, Stuart Wilson Smith. Another that's under my band name, SWSO. And so I have the one album, Stuart Wilson Smith, and then there's just a number of singles that are at Stuart Wilson, Stuart WS at .bandcamp.com, or you can just look me up on Google and you'll see all the channels that it's on.
Right.
because it's Spotify, iTunes, all the rest. And some of them are like the album is called "It's Not Just You, It's Everybody," and a lot of that is my reflection.
I downloaded it. I don't know, a couple of years ago when you put that out.
Oh yeah, thank you, Dick. Yeah, just a couple of years ago. And that's a lot of that is my reflections on living with mental illness and being a person of faith and what that's like. And so that's there's a lot of reference to the place I grew up in, the Maritimes of Canada as well. But more recent singles have been a little harder. I've brought distortion back into my life on the guitar and decided I had a little more energy in me to rock out. And so got into that.
I noticed when the Paulist band gets together at Christmas time, I think you play the drums.
Yes, we are called the Isaac Tones, named after Isaac Hecker. And I do play the drums. And then usually our faithful president, Father Eric Andrews, is the crooner. He will croon. He is the singer. And we've had Ricky Manalo, Father Ricky Manalo on the piano, Matthew Barrios on guitar. And I usually play drums. We do some jazz standards for the various Paulist streaming spectaculars.
And sometimes
that's what I call them. Yeah.
Sometimes Father Eric will even wear a smoking jacket while singing.
He has been known to do that.
Yeah. For the listeners that don't know, if you got to watch a Paulist streaming special, it will just completely rearrange the furniture of your mind about priests. I mean, you talk about you're not up to the Jesuits and the Franciscans. They're a bunch of stuffed shirts. You don't see their superior general in a smoking jacket crooning Sinatra with all these guys that are doing various ministries in the church, and they're playing musical instruments. It's just in the sanctuary of the church. It's just, and that's just one aspect. I mean, the ability to make fun of themselves, to be vulnerable doing it, to have a good time, to raise money for a good cause, of course, but still, I can't think of too many
poets. There's so many poets among them,
and it's just
there's so many
That's
poets.
a good point.
So many poets. Father Frank, Desiderio.
Oh yeah, that's a fair point. And I think that's one thing that got me into the Paulists was not just the charisms and the high level stuff, but individual Paulists themselves. And I like that you can kind of bring your whole self to this group. Yep. It's a very down to earth group of fellas who hopefully don't take their life and ministry overly seriously to the point where you think it's all on you. Because again, we're just we're working for the Holy Spirit here, and that's the bottom line. So it's nice to have that levity, I must admit, in the group, and not feel like you need to be stiff and have the starchy collar all the time.
There's a little bit of anti-clericalism, if I can say it. I don't know if that's an overstatement, but that's what I see.
That's an overstatement. It's a little bit of humanness. I think it just throws you. It's like, oh, what? You're not just an empty suit who's a functionary. There's an actual person in there. How did that happen?
Father Stu, this has been marvelous.
Oh, the pleasure has been mine. Thank you so much, Deacons, for having me.
Indeed.
Really
yes,
appreciate
we
it.
enjoyed it. Yes.
Yes, you've enlightened us.
Good luck with the green card.
Yes.
Get you back to work.
You know how that goes.
You're having too much fun.
I know, you can tell, eh?
Hey,
right. Well, thank you, guys.
All right. Nice
thank you for doing
this.
Okay, for sure. My pleasure, of course. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stu.
My pleasure. All right.
He came across as very genuine,
he did.
approachable, very humble in his recognition of his own mental condition and his struggles. And
that was amazing.
Yep.
I mean, how many people will, again, talk about not being a phony, to come right out and say, I've struggled with this. It's like, wow. And he's a young guy. I mean, it's not like this is wisdom and age. And, I finally decided to reveal this to people. I mean, God bless him. That's
very
under
the vulnerability. You expose that inner self that, I think that's one of the criticisms that I hear about priests being distant, clergy being distant, that they're not approachable because they seem to live in their own world that is protected from these kind of things. And boy, that's certainly not the case. You know that. We we all been exposed to many of the clergy, and that's so far from the truth.
Father Stu, if every parish in the United States and Canada, we should say, because he's Canadian,
Right.
had a priest like Father Stu, I think we'd have a lot less problems.
We'd have a parking lot
church.
problem is what we'd have. Fitting them all in there. That's what we'd have. Yeah, no, he's very thoughtful, and of course he's talented. He's got music and stuff, and I thought he was kind of whimsical too. I mean, I think there's a real deepness there.
You're right, Dennis. He has such a tremendous capacity for understanding, and yet he can make the most lighthearted joke immediately in the middle of his capacity for understanding.
Yeah.
I listened to some of the SoundCloud homilies that he did. Very, very deep, very but relevant. Again, he breaks open the word quite nicely, and gives a good takeaway from his homilies.
We've got to have him back soon.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Special thanks to El Jefe Paul Snatchko and our editor David Dalt. The Deacons Pod is powered by the Paulist Fathers. You can find us anywhere you get your podcasts, and of course at our own website, www.deaconspod.com. That's DEACONS with an S, Deacons, plural, pod, all one word, .com. And of course, we'd love to hear your comments at our email address, which is deaconspod, again, with an S, deacons, at paulist.org. That's PAULIST.org. Love to hear from you. That's our offering. We thank you for being with us. On behalf of our colleagues at the Missionary Society of St. Paul the Apostle, we wish you a future brighter than any past. Till next time.